The radio handset is already slick with blood when Weldon Honeycutt grabs it. It is May 14, 1969. 4 days into an assault that was supposed to take a few hours. His battalion has pushed up the northern face of Hill 937 three times. 3 times the jungle has swallowed them and spat them back. The man they call Blackjack is standing in a shallow depression carved out of mud and roots near the base of the mountain, listening to the sound of his companies being chewed apart above him. The flat crack of AK fire, the deeper concussion of RPGs detonating in the canopy, and then in the gaps between it all, the sound that never leaves you, men calling for a medic and a voice past shouting. 3 companies of the 3rd Battalion of 187th Infantry are on that slope. Alpha and Bravo are down to 67 men each, half their fighting strength. Charlie Company has just lost its commander, and Honeycutt is already getting on the radio to ask for more men to send up. There was just one problem with that morning's assault. And then there was another, and then another. 10 days and 11 assaults in, the hill that was supposed to fall in hours would become the most publicly debated battle of the entire Vietnam War, and the man who refused to stop climbing it would find himself remembered by some as a relentless, capable officer who refused to abandon his men's sacrifice, and by others as the commander whose stubbornness defined everything that had gone wrong. This is the story of Hamburger Hill. By May 1969, the Shau Valley in northern South Vietnam had been a strategic problem for nearly 4 years. Running roughly 25 miles along the western edge of Thu Thien Province, a mile from the Laotian border, the valley had served as one of the North Vietnamese Army's primary logistics corridors into the south since the mid-1960s. Weapons, ammunition, troops, all of it moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and into the valley, staged there for operations deeper into South Vietnam. The NVA had used the valley as a base area since 1966, and U.S. forces had largely ceded it after a bloody Special Forces camp evacuation that same year. In the 2 years after that, the NVA had reinforced it extensively: underground bunkers, connecting trench systems, supply caches. By 1969, the valley was not an insurgent haven. It was an established military base area. Garrisoned by main force NVA units, Operation Apache Snow was the answer. Launched on May 10, 1969, it was the third in a series of large-scale air-mobile operations designed to clear the Shau Valley. General Creighton Abrams, who had replaced Westmoreland as MACV commander in mid-1968, wanted the valley disrupted before the NVA could stage another offensive on the scale of Tet. The 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Colonel Joseph Conmy, was given the mission. 5 infantry battalions, American and South Vietnamese, would be inserted throughout the valley to find and destroy NVA forces. The thinking was that the enemy, as usual, would put up sharp resistance and then slip across the border into Laos before American firepower could be fully brought to bear. That assumption was almost exactly right, everywhere except on one mountain, Dong Ap Bia, Hill 937. The number was simply its elevation in meters, 937 meters above sea level, which put its summit at roughly 3,000 feet. It stood alone, unconnected to the ridgelines around it, heavily forested, its upper slopes dense with double and triple jungle canopy. Inside that canopy, invisible to aerial reconnaissance, the 7th and 8th Battalions of the NVA 29th Regiment had spent months building one of the most formidable defensive positions in the theater. Interlocking bunker lines, deep fighting positions reinforced with timber, a trench network that connected fighting positions across multiple ridges. The 29th Regiment, under the command of Colonel Ma Vinh Lan, had fought at Hue in 1968. These were not new troops, and they had no intention of retreating. Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt was 36 years old in May 1969, born in North Carolina during the Depression, and by his own account hardened by it. He had enlisted in the Army at 16, served with the 82nd Airborne, and by 1952 was a second lieutenant with the 187th Regimental Combat Team in Korea, the same unit, the Rakkasans, that he now commanded. In Korea, he had attracted the attention of then-Colonel William Westmoreland, who championed Honeycutt's career for the next decade and a half. He was commissioned through OCS, promoted to first lieutenant on the battlefield in Korea, and by January 1969 was commanding the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry. His call sign was Blackjack. His men also called him Tiger. His approach to combat was offensive, aggressive, and personal. He preferred to be close to the fighting, close to the radio, close to the men. The rap against him, even among some who respected him, was that he pushed, that once he was in a fight, he did not look for reasons to stop. Across the hill, Colonel Ma Vinh Lan had a different problem. His regiment was there because the Shau Valley was there. The 29th had moved into Dong Ap Bia's prepared positions sometime in late 1968 or early 1969, the exact date is not known, and had spent months improving what was already a formidable natural defensive terrain. The mountain's upper slopes were so steep and so jungle-choked that attackers would be unable to use most of their firepower advantages. Artillery rounds fused to detonate above the canopy could not penetrate the treetops to the bunkers beneath. Napalm and airstrikes would denude the canopy, but not necessarily destroy the reinforced fighting positions below. The American camps would have to go up the slope on foot, close enough to see the muzzle flash from the bunkers before they could destroy them. Here is where the math started working against Honeycutt. Before the first shots were fired, the mission on May 10 was a reconnaissance in force, not a set-piece assault. Kami's plan called for the battalions to move through the valley, make contact, assess enemy strength, and call in supporting arms. Honeycutt inserted his companies by helicopter into landing zones on the lower slopes and ridgelines around Hill 937 and began moving them upward. Contact on the first day was light. The second day was heavier. By May 11, when Alpha and Charlie companies pushed toward the mountain's northern approaches, they were running into fortified bunkers and taking casualties. Honeycutt requested the release of Bravo Company from Brigade Reserve. Kami agreed. Honeycutt now had all 4 companies of his battalion in the fight. What he did not have, not yet, was a clear picture of what was above him. Aerial surveillance could not penetrate the canopy. The only intelligence was what his own platoons were reporting, and what they were reporting was that every time they moved upward, they ran into more bunkers and more fire. Honeycutt still believed the NVA would break. Past experience said they would. The 29th Regiment had other ideas. The 13th was the worst day of the first week. Honeycutt ordered a coordinated attack by 3 companies up the northern slope. The terrain was brutal, steep, muddy, visibility sometimes under 10 meters in the triple canopy jungle. The NVA let the lead elements close to within grenade range before opening fire. Then it rained. The slope became a mudslide. Companies became intermixed as men tried to move laterally across the face of the mountain. Supporting fire from artillery and gunships was nearly impossible to place accurately without risk of hitting friendly troops. By the end of the day, the assault had been thrown back again. Charlie Company lost its commander. Alpha and Bravo were each down to roughly half strength. It was around this point that the name appeared. The men said the mountain was turning them into Hamburger. The name stuck before any reporter even arrived to write it down. On May 14, Honeycutt tried again. Same result. On May 15, the mountain had become news. Walter Cronkite mentioned it on the CBS Evening News, briefly, vaguely, just enough to put it on the national radar. On May 16, the first reporters reached the firebase. For the next 2 days, what they saw was a battalion that had fought itself to the edge and was being asked to keep going. Replacements were arriving from Camp Evans. But most were not infantrymen. They were rear echelon soldiers pulled forward to make up the numbers. Alpha and Bravo companies each had 67 men on their rosters. A full-strength rifle company should have had closer to 150. What happened in the next 72 hours would determine whether Hamburger Hill became a military operation or a symbol. On May 18, with the 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, the Currahis, finally in position south of the mountain, Kami ordered a 2-battalion assault. Rakkasans from the north, Currahis from the south. The attack went in during a blinding rainstorm. Men were loaded down with 40 magazines of rifle ammunition and extra grenades for the bunkers. Delta Company of the 3187 clawed its way to within 75 meters of the summit before the NVA poured fire into them. Small arms, RPGs, grenades rolling down the slope. Every officer in Delta Company was killed or wounded. The company fell back. The assault was over for that day. 2 days later, on May 20, Major General Melvin Zayas, division commander, gave Honeycutt one more company, a company of the 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, and authorized a final assault. 2 hours of airstrikes hit the mountain before dawn. Artillery followed. At first light, 4 companies went up the slope from multiple directions. The NVA resistance was still there, still fierce until it wasn't. Sometime before noon on May 20, the 29th Regiment's surviving soldiers slipped across the border into Laos. Specialist 4th Class Johnny Jackson of A Company 2506 grabbed an M60 machine gun and advanced alone to carry men across the final 20 meters to the summit. By the end of the day, there were no living NVA soldiers on the mountain. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, Honeycutt's Rakkasans, had suffered 39 killed and 290 wounded over 10 days. Total American casualties for the operation were approximately 72 killed and 72 wounded. American and South Vietnamese forces counted 630 enemy dead on the mountain. A Special Forces patrol on the Laotian side of the border reported an additional estimated 100 NVA dead and wounded evacuated during the battle. The 7th and 8th Battalions of the 29th NVA Regiment had, by the available evidence, been effectively destroyed as combat formations. The hill fell on May 20. The same day, on the floor of the United States Senate, Edward Kennedy stood up to speak. Kennedy called the assault on Dong Ap Bia senseless and irresponsible. He said it was madness, symptomatic of a mentality and a policy that required immediate attention. American boys, he told the Senate, were too valuable to be sacrificed for a false sense of military pride. Kennedy was not alone. The AP's Jay Sharbut, attached to the 187th Infantry during the battle, had filed his story on May 19. the day before the hill fell. Sharbut quoted a wounded trooper saying that Blackjack wouldn't stop until he killed every one of them. The story ran in newspapers across the country. The Life magazine issue of June 27 ran photographs of 241 Americans killed in Vietnam the previous week, prefaced by a note from a letter one of the 5 Hamburger Hill dead had written during a break in the fighting. "You may not be able to read this," it said. "I am writing in a hurry. I see death coming up the hill." On June 5, 1969, 16 days after the battle ended, the Army abandoned Hill 937 General Abrams, briefed on the congressional outcry, put it in one sentence to his guests at a private dinner shortly after. The last time the 29th NVA Regiment came out of North Vietnam, it destroyed Hue. Abrams understood what the battle had cost. He also understood what the 29th Regiment had cost a year earlier. Neither figure made for easy politics. The Battle of Hamburger Hill was one of the last large set-piece assault operations the American military conducted in Vietnam. Within months, Vietnamization, the policy of drawing down American combat forces and handing the fight to South Vietnamese units, was accelerating. Whether the battle directly caused that acceleration is disputed by historians. What is not disputed is that Hamburger Hill entered the national vocabulary as a shorthand for everything Americans feared the war had become: costly, purposeful in tactical terms, strategically circular, and fought at the expense of the young men sent to execute it. Weldon Honeycutt was promoted. He retired from the Army as a brigadier general. He never apologized for the battle and never stopped defending it. In 2017, he told an interviewer that his proudest moment in the Army was finally taking Hill 937. He reflected on the men he had led. "These guys really feel a compassion for each other," he said. "They are in their 60s or 70s. I still see them as kids. I will always love them." He attended the annual Hamburger Hill reunion at Fort Campbell every year for decades. The old man among old men, the battalion commander as family patriarch. He died in 2021 at the age of 88. Edward Kennedy escalated his attacks on Vietnam policy through 1969 and 1970, becoming one of the war's most prominent Senate critics. His Hamburger Hill speech drew a direct response from the Nixon White House and landed Kennedy on Nixon's enemies list by 1971. The 29th NVA Regiment reconstituted after its losses. It would fight again. And Hill 937, taken at a cost of 72 American dead and 372 wounded, abandoned 16 days later, still sits in the Shau Valley. The jungle has grown back over everything. If you found this story interesting, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you learned something new, and leave a comment telling me which overlooked battle from the Vietnam War you think deserves its own video. This video depicts real historical events and real people. All documented names, dates, unit designations, and casualty figures are drawn from the historical record, including after-action reports, the account in Samuel Zafiri's Hamburger Hill, Presidio Press, 1988, declassified military records, and contemporary news reporting. Some dialogue, interior detail, and sequence have been reconstructed for storytelling purposes and should not be taken as verbatim historical transcript. Note, casualty figures for Hamburger Hill vary slightly across sources. This account uses the most widely cited figures of 72 American killed and 372 wounded for the full operation.